Hello everyone! I'm very excited today to talk about one of my favorite scenes in Jane Eyre. If you've been watching this series of reviews and comparisons for any length of time, you surely know by now that I love the Gypsy scene. Our discussion today actually has two components, the Gypsy scene and Mason's arrival, which coincides with it. This material occurs in chapters 18 and 19 of the book. So Mr. Rochester has left his guests, telling them that he'll be gone all day on business. In his absence, an unexpected stranger arrives, Richard Mason, all the way from Jamaica. Jane, ever the people watcher, has kind of a peculiar way of describing Mason. She says he's a fine-looking man, but there's something in his face that displeased. She uses words like vacant, unsettled, and inanimate, and she says his eye wandered and had no meaning in its wandering. This gave him an odd look, such as I never remembered to have seen. For a handsome and not an unamiable-looking man, he repelled me exceedingly. Shortly after his arrival, a servant announces that a gypsy woman has come, saying she wants to tell all of the single young lady's fortunes. The elders protest, but Blanche insists on seeing her. When she comes back, she's clearly bothered, but she won't say why. After all the young ladies in the house party have seen the gypsy, the servant comes to Jane with the gypsy's insistence that all the young single ladies in the household come to see her. Jane thinks it's nonsense, but to humor the gypsy, she goes. The old woman is cryptic and behaves very strangely, asking a lot of personal questions about Jane and about Rochester and Blanche, none of which has anything to do with telling Jane's fortune. The gypsy woman then has Jane kneel on the rug and closely examines her face, giving this strange speech about how her features declare things about her character, and the voice drones on until suddenly it slips a little, and then the gypsy tries to recover and make Jane go away, but in vain, and Jane realizes that the gypsy is actually Rochester in disguise. While Rochester is enjoying a good chuckle over the joke he just played on everyone, Jane is quickly trying to determine if she said anything foolish. She didn't, so she's less mortified than she might have been. The mood changes, however, when she tells him of his visitor. The news of Mason's arrival causes a shock. He wants to know how the guests have reacted, and then he asks Jane what she would do if everyone shunned him. Jane replies that she would stay. Her promise of loyalty is a conditional one, though. Asked if she would dare censure for his sake, she says, "I could dare it for the sake of any friend who deserved my adherence, as you, I am sure, do." So she pledges her constancy, so long as Rochester isn't guilty of something truly wrong. That's gonna be important later. Now, for anyone watching who's unfamiliar with the story, you may have some questions. Why on earth does Rochester do this crazy thing? What's so important about this Mason guy? Why is the gypsy scene, which is kind of obscure given that it's only featured in 3 of the 9 major English language adaptations, one of my favorites? Well, first, I think Rochester has 3 purposes in putting on this elaborate ruse. 1, to scare Blanche away by planting a seed of doubt about his wealth. She wants to marry him, but she wants to marry him for his money. If he makes her think that he doesn't have any money, then she won't be interested anymore. 2, to find out Jane's feelings toward him, something that he can't ask her about point blank, as that would be extremely improper. And 3, to provoke his guests, and Jane. Remember, when Rochester is not being gloomy and miserable, he does have a sense of fun. Mason is significant because, well, it's hard to talk about it without giving too much away, and I have tried not to spoil the major events in the book, even though I'm not sure anyone's watching who doesn't already know. Essentially, Mason is a link to Rochester's past, a past that he'd like to keep hidden away. When he finds out that Mason's shown up at his house and been circulating among his guests, his first concern is that Mason's come to spill the beans, and that in Rochester's absence, he's just gone and told everybody everything. If he's exposed Rochester, intentionally or not, Rochester will not only be publicly disgraced, but he will also lose his chance of happiness with Jane. Mason himself is not someone I generally find tremendously interesting, but his arrival and his interference in Rochester's life, and by extension in Jane's life, is crucial to various plot developments. As for why I prefer the Gypsy scene, I don't know if I can articulate all the reasons. I remember reading this scene when I was about 13 years old and just loving it. I thought it was exciting and mysterious and romantic. I like the element of disguise. I like the way Jane handles the whole thing with her wary, raised eyebrow approach. I think it's hilarious that Rochester thought this bizarre idea was the best way to get results. I love the ping-pong match of their dialogue with the Gypsy asking leading questions and Jane being too clever and dodging them. I remember getting caught up with the characters in the Gypsy's long-winded speech and sharing Jane's bewilderment. And it's such a cute moment when Jane's kinda mad at him and chastises him a little and won't help him untie the knot of his costume, but she still can't help forgiving him anyway. I love all these things. The thing is, none of the adaptations of the scene satisfy me. Maybe I'm too picky, which is very likely, but none of them have played out quite the way I have always pictured the scene in my head. And frankly, I like that version the best. Okay, on to the adaptations. I guess we'll skip 1934 because it doesn't have a Gypsy scene or anything remotely like it, nor does it have the Mason character, so there's nothing to talk about. And 1943 I talked about a little last time. There is no Gypsy scene, and for the sake of condensing the story, they attach Mason's arrival to the end of Rochester's conversation with Jane when she leaves the party, something that 2011 also did. Jane and Rochester happen to be standing near enough the door to see Mason arrive and announce himself, thus ending their tender moment. Wells's Rochester is so upset he just stands there shaking for a second, and then he pulls Jane out of the way and closes the door, stealing just one more moment alone with her before facing Mason. Interesting note from my checklist, this one and 2006 are the only ones to have Rochester say the line, "I wish I were in a quiet island with only you." One thing I noticed after watching all these scenes one after another is that in several of the versions that don't have a Gypsy scene, they do sort of offer a substitute. The Gypsy comes to tell fortunes, and these other interpretations have Rochester, or even one time Blanche, do so without a disguise as a means of entertainment. 1970 was the first to do this. We see Rochester with playing cards, predicting his own future and letting his guests interpret everything as a sign of approaching marriage to Blanche. Jane interrupts with news of someone who's come from the West Indies, and Rochester mystifies his guests with his change of mood. Just outside the room before going to see Mason, he pauses to talk to Jane. Placing his hand over hers, he confides that Mason has the power to destroy his dreams and asks her if she'd dare censure for his sake. For those of you keeping track at home, I think that's the second time Rochester's taken her hand in this version, and though now's not the time to get all Twitter-pated about it, you can tell Jane's not oblivious. This version does have an oddly dramatic reveal of Mason's face. The build-up makes you think either he's gonna be hideous, or he's someone we'll recognize from earlier in the film. Drums roll, he swiftly turns around, and it's just a guy we've never seen before. Kinda strange. Okay, 1973 actually has a Gypsy scene! Ah! And it's one of only two versions to do it properly and have Rochester dressed up as the Gypsy himself, so that's very, very good. Unfortunately, it's over so fast. As usual with 73, everything up to Jane's interview with the Gypsy follows the book very closely. Mason arrives, and hey, this is one of the only times when I'm familiar with the actor playing Mason from something other than Jane Eyre. It's Edward de Souza, who I loved in 1962's Phantom of the Opera with Herbert Lom. This is one of the only versions I've seen where the guests seem suspicious of Mason at first, perhaps because he comes from Jamaica and he's different. He's also one of the most anxious Masons. He appears to dread meeting Rochester and at first seems both physically and emotionally uncomfortable. We see none of the fascination with him that's shown in the book. He doesn't become the center of attention, no girls giggle with admiration, and he isn't exactly peppered with questions about his relation to Rochester. But it's when the Gypsy shows up that I start to feel a little at odds with this adaptation. When Blanche returns from her interview, she's very angry and insists the woman be thrown out. I picture Blanche as reacting more stoically than that. She refuses to answer questions about what the gypsy said and separates herself from everyone else to brood in silence. This Blanche is much more loud and dramatic about it. I'm also slightly disappointed by Jane's interaction with the gypsy. She's skeptical from the start, and they move the line "something of a masquerade I suspected" from the end of the scene to the beginning, and she seems to figure out it's Rochester as soon as she sees and hears the gypsy. To humor him, she goes on with the charade, but acts amused through the whole thing, and we see Rochester play the gypsy for only 50 seconds with her before she calls him out on it. 50 seconds?! Maybe they did it this way to address the unlikelihood that Jane could sit so close to the man she loves and not recognize him. I agree that it might seem improbable, especially since she spent so much time watching him, but in my mental version, Rochester's done such a thorough job disguising his appearance and his voice that I do think the scene can work with Jane only realizing something's up toward the very end, when his voice drops like several pitches lower, and then she sees the ring on his finger and she knows for sure that it's him. I've actually started to wonder if the whole scene was filmed in its entirety and then in post-production it got whittled down. At least 2/3 of the book's dialogue is missing, and the scene starts abruptly in the middle of the interview. Anyway, I'm still happy enough just that they did it, and I will say that Jane spoiling his joke early on does make Rochester's reaction even funnier.
You smile at my jargon.
And at your voice, sir.
What?
And the ring on your hand also.
You witch.
Cusack's Jane is as good-natured as she always is. She barely reproaches him for tricking her. And we get this little addition where Jane realizes how late it is and tries to leave, but Rochester wants her to stay.
So it is past 11 o'clock. I must go.
No, stay. I am not here, remember. So we are free.
To put him off, Jane brings up Mason, and there goes Rochester's playful mood. Jason's Rochester is especially devastated by the news. I think it's even more noticeable because of how jovial he was a second before. The 1983 version is the only other version to do the gypsy scene right, but before we talk about that, first there's Mason's arrival. The main thing I notice about this Mason is his unique accent, which is actually pointed out by one of the guests. That, and he has Frank Langella Dracula hair. These guests are much more receptive of him than in 1973, and their chattiness here makes it even more awkward when they sit in silence later waiting for Blanche to come back from seeing the gypsy. When she does, she's clearly irritated, but won't say anything. This, to me, is the most satisfying portrayal of the gypsy currently in existence on film. Dalton does a great job with the old woman voice, and he went full throttle with the costume.
But, Mother, I did not come here to hear Mr. Rochester's fortune. I came to hear my own.
Your fortune is yet doubtful. Chance has offered you a measure of happiness. It depends on yourself to stretch out your hand and take it up. Whether you will do so is the question.
The scene is sufficiently long and includes Rochester's prying questions, Jane's parrying, and his close examination of her face. What I don't quite like is how angry Jane is when Rochester reveals himself. He's practically giddy with his success, but she's mad. I get it. She's embarrassed, and her mind's running over everything that was just said, trying to determine if she made a fool out of herself. But I don't really expect her to yell at him the way she does. It's such a sharp contrast with the last version. Of course, very quickly after that, Jane tells Rochester of Mason's arrival, and there goes all his fun. A bit of trivia from my checklist. This and 73 are the only versions where Rochester says, "Off, ye lendings," as he struggles to get out of his costume. There's no gypsy in the 1996 version. Right after Jane leaves the party, Mason arrives. He seems unsure of himself, and likewise, Mrs. Fairfax doesn't know what to do with him, and hold on, wait a minute. That's Edward D'Souza! Again! That's gotta be a record. One actor playing the same role in two different Jane Eyre adaptations 23 years apart. Anyway, Mrs. Fairfax really seems at a loss here. No wonder, Rochester never has guests, and now he has a large party and an unexpected visitor, so this is all new territory for her. We then see Mason taken to his room, and later watching from his door as Grace Poole comes stumbling down the stairs, and he sneaks out. All this stuff from Mason's perspective is poetic license, but that's fine. It's different. We haven't seen it done that way before. It's just surprising, given that this version is under 2 hours long and there are certain things that they cut, that they gave this much time to it. Like the 1970 version, 1997 tries to throw some kind of fortune-telling in there by showing Blanche attempting to read Rochester's palm. Then Mrs. Fairfax comes in and introduces Mason, and Rochester looks mildly disturbed for a moment and leaves with him. And that's it. It's very quick. Streamlined. Now, the 2006 version came so close. There's so much I love about it. I like Blanche's blasé reaction after seeing the Gypsy woman. She puts on this dismissive act, pretending that it's no big deal, but you can tell she's shaken. And of the 3 versions of the Gypsy scene, this is probably the most faithful and most thorough in terms of how much dialogue is kept and how Jane reacts to everything from the Gypsy to Rochester's reveal. I even think the actress who plays the Gypsy does a great job. But it's just such a huge disappointment to me that Rochester, instead of playing the Gypsy himself, hires someone else to do it while he goes and hides himself behind a partition and listens in. It's just not the same! Everything else about the scene makes me happy, though. Wilson's Jane is the only one who I feel conveys all the right emotions at the right times, and her mix of surprise, dismay, and indignation is spot on. She doesn't like being tricked or taken advantage of, yet she can't stay mad at him either. I love Jane and Rochester's interaction here. The conversational tone of their dialogue, and then the way it turns serious, is so natural. The news of Mason's arrival has wounded Rochester somehow. Jane can see that, and even though she doesn't know the cause, it hurts her just as much. She's so loyal and compassionate in this moment, and he's yearning for comfort, but still restrained. It's such a well-done adaptation of the scene. Their performances make it all so much more effective. A couple interesting side notes. None of the versions have Jane say the line, "I give my life to serve you," but here she says something similar, "Can I help you, sir? I'd do anything for you." Also, this and 2011 are the only adaptations to convey that Jane's promise to stay with Rochester is a conditional one. Jane says she'd do anything for him, and Rochester says, "What if I asked you to do something that was wrong?"
I know. I know the answer, Jane. You could not.
Also, they close the scene on an even deeper note, Rochester asking Jane if she believes in redemption, and Jane replies that if you have sinned, you can be redeemed. Interesting that they added this in as a reiteration of things discussed in previous conversations. The 2011 version, as I said, does not have a gypsy. Like 1943, the news of Mason's arrival comes as Rochester is asking Jane why she's upset and leaving the party. Mrs. Fairfax interrupts, and I like how Mrs. Fairfax reads Rochester's grave expression and is like, "Oh snap, have I done wrong?" This is the only version where Jane says she'd dare condemnation for the sake of any friend who deserved it. Also, this is the only version where Rochester gives a very young-looking Mason a hearty reception, insincere though it may be. So those are my observations on the Gypsy scene and Mason's arrival. Of the 3 different Gypsy scenes, could I take half of 83 and half of 2006 and smush them together to make one perfect adaptation of it? There are actually 2 other versions to whom I'd like to give honorable mention. One is the 1957 Italian version, which I reviewed a few years ago. I believe it's the only foreign version I've watched that had a gypsy scene, even if they had the same idea as 2006 to have a woman play the gypsy while Rochester hides out of sight. The other honorable mention I want to give is to the musical version, or at least to the original Broadway cast recording of it, for its inclusion of the scene on the track titled The Gypsy. James Barber's Rochester has a great gypsy woman voice, on par with Dalton's performance, except possibly more difficult to sustain because he's singing. It's a really fun number, and it has a great violin solo as well. But like I said in the beginning, the only one that I'm 100% satisfied with is the one that's in my head. But who knows, we haven't seen the last of the Jane Eyre adaptations, I'm sure, and maybe someday an adaptation will come along that has a truly satisfying gypsy scene. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your own thoughts in the comments down below. I look forward to reading them and interacting with you all as always, and thanks for watching!